at least we see it at a macro level. Certainly every company is dealing with its own situations, as Tom and Jerry noted. OpEx was one of the big question marks we had. That's been at least answered through the FCC released in early September. CapEx limitations, by and large, the questions around those have been resolved, as well as the FCC put out a worksheet through USAC to help people be able to interpret the capital investment limits as far as we know. To be clear, again, I'm talking implementation. We actually have reconsideration items pending on each of those, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But from an implementation perspective, our understanding is people largely have on the OpEx and CapEx limits on the non-model side sufficient information to process what those mean for their companies. Other areas, though, where there is less clarity, competitive overlap. That was mentioned in the last discussion. I will say, on the non-model side, I think it's actually a pretty good process. To Bill, your question about voice, it's the census block. It's going to have to be in the census block. They're going to have to show that they have the capability to port telephone numbers in the census block. If you go back and read the order, there's a lot of stuff in there, and NTCA and US Telecom actually worked pretty hard towards the end of the whole reform discussion when the chairman was thinking of dropping a whole bunch of stuff on us to make sure that the competitive overlap challenge process was as robust as possible. We tried for both the model and the non-model side to do this. The model side, the problem we had in the competitive overlap process, quite frankly, was the price cap precedent for competitive overlap was a joke. I mean, you watched CenturyLink, you watched AT&T try to push back against WISPs who were claiming they could offer wide swaths of service, and the FCC wasn't taking it. They just wouldn't take it. So the competitive overlap on the model side, the ACAM side, really followed that and ended up with very little in the way of a meaningful competitive challenge process. It was sort of like NFL instant replay, but you need to have conclusive evidence to overturn the call on the 477. In this case, non-model side, the burden of proof will be on the competitor. The competitor will have to show they offer qualifying voice and broadband, can port telephone numbers, access to 911, all of these things in the census block in question to 85% of the customers in that census block. And one of the things, though, that's an open question that we're still fighting about a bit, and I don't know if we'll get it resolved now, but we hopefully will before the competitive overlap challenge process starts, is in order to determine 85%, you need both the numerator and the denominator. So we need to know which locations they're claiming to serve and put that over the denominator of the housing units in order to figure out whether they are really serving the 85%. They'll say, too, that they need to show up. Again, if they don't file, they don't exist for purposes of competitive overlap. So they need to actually take the time to show up, and the only benefit they get is, at best, you might lose some support. And as Tom and Jared mentioned, we have 3 different disaggregation options in the order, and I did some rough calculations of one company that I happened to look at that had 2,000 census blocks competitively overlapped in the Southeast. It was 500 square miles. That company serves 3,000 square miles. That's a 16% competitive overlap. If you assume that the competitor serves 85% of the customers in every census block that's covered with voice and broadband, and that competitor, as a result, loses 3% of its universal service support. And if it loses that, it only loses CAF BLS, not high-cost loop support. So there are a lot of things around competitive overlap that I think are beneficial, but the guys in the last panel noted probably the biggest open item, which is what's the data set? What's the starting point for determining competitive overlap? The question came about, do we really know if this is the right data set to be using to measure competitive overlap? We don't know that, but it's probably a good yardstick to use as a, if not worst case scenario, because June 30th might show your competitor advanced a bit from where they were as of December 31, 2015. It at least shows a pretty good stretch of where your competitor is, and if you assume, again, they're going to serve every one of those census blocks with 85% or greater coverage, you can then make an assessment of how much overlap do they have, and then run the disaggregation formulas and see how much is this really going to affect my non-model USF support. So that information is at least out there, but we do have some important issues pending, of course, too, to improve that. So the last piece on the non-model side, I'd say it's a big open question that we're still working with the FCC to get clarity on, and will feed into our reconsideration petition I'll talk about in a minute, is the budget control. The guys in the last panel mentioned that the budget control is something that we don't quite know yet. The FCC is going to be releasing that projection of what the first half of 2016 budget control is before November 1. I don't understand why this couldn't have been done sooner, but it wasn't. I think it had something to do with the fact that they were having trouble dealing with counting standalone broadband lines for 2016 projections. But in any event, the budget control for the last 4 months of 2016 was on average 4.7% per company. That differed depending upon how much sort of your cost characteristics. Higher cost companies may have had a higher percentage, lower cost companies lower, based upon the way the FCC calculated it. But the average was 4.7%. It may be something higher for the first half of 2016. We don't know yet. But that is a challenge, is not knowing what that budget control is going to look like. And that's going to be something that I think will probably take a couple of years, actually, for people to figure out. Much like for those of you who got high-cost loop support, you saw it because it was declining at a certain percentage per year. People were falling off the cliff was the phrase that was used. It took several years before people realized that that was really happening and internalized that. And it suddenly, over time, it actually became relatively predictable. You knew that it's about 7% per year high-cost loop support would fall off, and companies would ultimately fall off the cliff, and that was an on-average number. I anticipate this budget control will be a bit like that. It's going to take some time to internalize and incorporate, but over time may be something that people can predict. The other effect of the budget control that we're looking at, and this feeds into our reconsideration petition and to a point that Tom and Jerry raised, is what does this mean for the support of standalone broadband? The big win in this, in theory at least, in part on the non-model side, was getting a standalone broadband mechanism. The problem is that it's a rebuilt engine without enough gas in it. There's not enough funding in the system, because of the budget control in particular, to really make that an effective tool. For those of you who already have standalone broadband, it will probably help a little bit perhaps, because at least you'll be getting some support today where you never got any before. For those of you who are thinking about aggressively marketing standalone broadband, you'll have to look at your circumstances, but I suspect that the budget control probably will have a serious detrimental effect on how much standalone broadband support is available out there on a non-model basis, because the budget control is going to, in all likelihood, wipe a good portion of that out first. Again, that's for those in particular who haven't offered standalone broadband before. If you already are offering standalone broadband, you haven't been getting support, so you might get something, at least an incremental win. But it's not the win it should be, and we recognize that, which is why we filed a petition for reconsideration that basically says that this is an insufficient amount of support, and this proves it. In the past, we've argued budget. We've said there's not enough money in the system. But we've never had proof. Your local rates didn't go up unless the rate floor made them go up. Your customers didn't have to pay more. You weren't delivering worse service because you found a way to keep delivering good service. So to everybody in the outside world, it looked like you had enough universal service support. Now it doesn't look like that, because the FCC's budget control makes it such that the standalone broadband fix that they promised the world doesn't actually give you enough money to sell standalone broadband at the same rate as it does in urban areas. So even if this reform didn't fix the standalone broadband problem fully, it sets us up for the future to hopefully fix the standalone broadband problem. And at the very least, it gives us a pathway away from access lines that are declining, which is not a very good unit of measure to use for a long-run, long-term health of a universal service mechanism. So the one last thing I'll note on the budget, too, is that the budget will move in different ways. I'm talking non-model right now. CAF ICC. CAF ICC